from our experience, DevOps continues to grow, and although ITIL continues to be the primary framework within which we operate, that's our roots, I think, from our BMC partnership, we see more and more how the Agile framework can really assist in the work that we do and the work that our customers do. And it helps us to provide better guidance and to really keep up with some of the changes within the industry. So looking back to the history, ITIL itself has been around for many years. I believe this year is, if I'm not mistaken, the 30th anniversary of what was then called the IT Infrastructure Library. So this was originally a functional-based practice. It originated in the UK, so there's still, I think, a much stronger presence in Europe than there has been in the United States. We found that it really wasn't until version 2, at about when Y2K was all of a sudden a big issue, and there was a lot more need for governance in IT, that this really became more heavily adopted. But I think in the U.S., perhaps because of the speed with which we operate here, I think it's a much more fast-paced environment. I think there has been still some resistance. So in looking at how ITIL has evolved, there have been changes. Most recently, version 3 was released in 2007, and there were additional updates in 2011, and there's always a lot of discussion and debate going on about the various practices, but it's evolved from that original functional-based practice into a more service lifecycle-based practice, looking at how services are developed through the full lifecycle. It does incorporate teachings from the first 2 versions, but it starts here and gives us more of a guidance of how do we start with the actual business side? How do we integrate with the business as opposed to seeing IT as a separate organization? So how do we understand better the strategy, the focus that the business has on the marketplace, and really keeping up to date with both the patterns of business activity on a cyclical basis as well as the overall growth of our industries. So how do we keep up with ever-changing technologies and innovations? To give you a little bit of background, if you're not as familiar with ITIL, there are a number of certifications you can achieve for the ITIL IT Service Management Framework, starting with ITIL Foundation, and you'll learn about how we start with the axis of the life cycle. So we start with service strategy. We deliver a strategy, which then gets handed off to our service design phase. Service design incorporates more of the technical side, so we move from the business side to the technical side. We create a service design package, which then gets handed off to service transition. In service transition, we focus a lot on the nuts and bolts testing and training before we then finally go into service operations. So our service release package gets distributed into the production environment. The output from service operations, the day-to-day kind of ongoing IT work, are the reports that then can help to inform our decisions about improvements for the organization. So that's where we enter the continual service improvement phase of the life cycle, and then it continues from there. When I say that there's still a lot of debate and discussion about the processes, how they should be implemented, that relates to this outer circle here, which is called the ITIL Complementary Guidance. So there are, in addition to these 5 core lifecycle titles, there are a number of other books out there, ITIL for all different types of organizations. There's even ITIL for the federal government, so we've been involved Nancy Donnelly, who I believe is on the call here with us today. She's one of our process consultants and has been involved in authoring part of the defense ITIL documentation. So it really can be adopted by all different types of organizations and all different sizes of organizations. So in our practice, working with both the Atlassian and JIRA service desk, as well as working with BMC's Remedy, Force, and Footprints offerings, we're often working with small and medium-sized businesses. So we can even adapt the ITIL teachings to smaller organizations. And I think an important thing there, especially when we're dealing with smaller organizations, we need to be able to employ and deploy ITIL in as easy a way as possible. We need to do it often quickly to show quick wins to the organization. And that's where we find that the Agile methodology can really help us. So part of what I am hoping to show to you all today and to discuss today is how Agile can help us not just with the software implementation side, but also with process implementation. And really, Agile and ITIL are very complementary. It's not Agile versus ITIL. Both practices can coexist very well within our IT organizations. So looking at a list of the processes associated with ITIL, I've highlighted here a number of processes that we can focus on or we can use when looking at Agile. So when we're trying to implement some of these processes, Agile can really come in handy. When an organization starts to consider adoption of process improvement, I think that there is often, as Dick mentioned, I am going to talk about and focus a little bit on change management here, because I think a lot of organizations start with, well, you know, the basics. You've got to do your break fix, which is incident management. And then if they get a little bit more sophisticated, they may start with problem management. So getting to the root cause, making sure that issues within the organization that are impacting multiple users, making sure that those issues are resolved as opposed to just kind of putting a Band-Aid fix on things. And then I think a lot of organizations get bogged down with change management, configuration management as well, because that's also a large effort, but change management can be difficult because it's seen as being very oppressive. The change management process, as outlined in ITIL, requires a lot of approvals. It's not a very agile process in and of itself. And I think that's one of the biggest issues, and there's still a lot of discussion among experts on both sides, on the Agile side and on the ITIL side, about how to best implement change management. There are a number of things that we find work for Agile organizations, or organizations where there's a lot of development ongoing. Not every IT organization does development in-house, but even for organizations that are just releasing off-the-shelf products on a regular basis and supporting off-the-shelf products, it's important to understand how changes to the environment, not just software, but also changes to hardware, changes to the network infrastructure, updates to off-the-shelf software, how that can then impact the users. We do still need to have a certain level of governance in the organization. So especially organizations that need to abide by particular regulations, Sarbanes-Oxley and other types of governance, it's really critical that we have the appropriate approvals noted and that we can keep track of that. but how do we do it in a way that's not cumbersome to the IT organization and to the managers and staff members who are working hard to try to keep the lights on and keep other pieces of the IT infrastructure going.
Yeah. Hey, Nikki.
Yes.
Let me just jump in and tell a real short story.
Sure.
And this has to do with a customer that I visited not too long ago, and it's a DoD customer, and we've been working there for quite some time. And like a lot of big, large organizations, progress is pretty slow there. But I really thought that they understood the value of ITIL and what it would provide within the organizations. They have, again, like a number of big companies, quite a few different contractors that work there. And they had one ITIL consultant that was there, and he was very good. He knew his stuff. He had great ideas. And I would say maybe his only a problem was that he was too passionate about ITIL. And the unfortunate thing is that the customer didn't really see the value. And like your example with change management, they thought it was a little bit too slow and too cumbersome, so they fired him. Just like that, and which doesn't, and to get fired in the government, you really almost have to be caught stealing something or something. But anyway, he was a contractor, so that's what happened. But some of the vendors, and BMC is a good example, are really starting to get this, and they have this new product or the new version. It's called Remedy 9, and in there they have this product called Smart IT, and it's just an excellent example of how simple they've made the whole change management process, because they understand that if they don't want to get fired either, and if they start to blame the tool rather than the consultant, then they're in trouble. So it's just very easy to use. And if it's arguably the easiest, simplest, most well-designed change management system out there. So it's coming, and I think it's a result of this movement towards more agility and DevOps. So, and another thing I forgot to mention, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A box. Maybe that was understood, but we will get to them at the end. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, Dick. And I think that does, again, speak a lot to what we're seeing with our customers across the board, even for smaller organizations and large organizations as well, that they can't afford to be slow. They can't afford to spend time implementing processes that aren't going to have positive returns, and that they can't afford to spend time on implementing processes that won't be adopted. So I've given a little bit of the history of ITIL and talked about some of the processes and some of the challenges that we face. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Agile method, some of the Agile methods. So within the Agile community, there are a number of different ways to implement Agile. I've given some examples here. I think some of them, the ones that I have more experience with, would be the Kanban and Scrum, but there are certainly a lot of others, even some new ones that are not on this list. But essentially, it's just different ways of managing the requirements within the organization. And again, a lot of it does go back to change management. So looking at Scrum, for example, so within the Scrum Lifecycle, there is a discovery phase at the start. So during the discovery phase, there's some basic outlines, decisions made, and then we go into this process or an iterative process of releases. So we've got, which we call sprints. So there are, within this particular sprint, there are several activities that we undertake. So we have planning that's ongoing. We develop the change or develop the particular release. We review once this new software or code has been released, and then we have a retrospective. How do we make improvements then during the next sprint? I have the release showing here at the end of this, in this example, 6 week period. But releases can be done at any point, so they could be done after a particular sprint if it's determined that that's how the organization wants to run. And I think one interesting thing that I found at a recent meeting, an industry meeting that I attended, was that they were talking about how do you implement change management with according to some of the ITIL framework, but also within an organization that practices Agile or Scrum development. And I think the interesting thing there was that one organization said that they treated these sprints and the related releases as standard changes. So for those who are familiar with ITIL, you may remember that a standard change does not go before the Change Advisory Board. It is a predictable, reliable change that's expected to have little to no impact on the infrastructure and can be conducted then with what we call local levels of approval. And in this case, it would be the Scrum Master who would provide that local level of approval prior to the release of that particular sprint. So again, we're working within the framework of ITIL, but we are conducting Agile development and following Agile development practices. Also, something here that to mention for those of you who may not be as familiar with Agile development, when we go through these sprints, the expectation is that we're not doing a lot of the requirements and certainly not a lot of the build out up front. We're keeping a backlog of requirements, but new requirements can be submitted at any time during this process. So you will have a project sponsor or somebody on the what we would call the business side who may be the gatekeeper and making sure that all of the requirements have particular priority levels associated with them, and things should be done in order of priority. But overall, it's going to be, kind of up to the Scrum Master and the development team to determine which particular requirements or which what we call user stories are going to be covered in each sprint, or which can be covered in each sprint. It's up to the development team to provide those estimates for each user story. So for a particular, a new report that needs to be added to the software, for example, the development team should be able to provide an estimate for that effort, and then from that they can determine during what period can that particular enhancement or requirement be fulfilled. And you'll notice that these sprints are time-bound. So here we have the example, probably the standard is 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks, they are able to have a finished product that's ready to move into production. So to give an example, when we're working with customers for implementation of the software of our partners, BMC and Atlassian, we often work in a similar way, and we're moving more towards what BMC calls its Agile hybrid methodology. So this is in particular for their Remedy Force product, but it can be employed for any project. Agile hybrid means that it's a little bit modified from traditional Agile, but we do follow the same premise that we are going to implement, for example, incident management, or a portion of incident management, depending on the size of the project. And we are going to have a product that's ready for production within 2 weeks. And then we may do some additional development and testing, and then in another 2 weeks we'll have additional features added so that we're able to see quick wins up front. And also we're able to adapt to issues that may come up, and we're able to adapt to new requirements. For every organization, I found a quote that I liked today. it comes from W. Edwards Deming, and that quote is, and let me make sure I get it correct because I want to quote him properly. But it is not necessary to change. Survival is not mandatory. The reason I like W. Edwards Deming, his name's going to come up a little bit later in my presentation, but essentially he was one of the forefathers of this whole process of continual service improvement that we employ now in the ITIL framework. And I think it's really relevant to looking at the way organizations have to adapt today. Here is another example of an Agile methodology in practice. So the Atlassian tool JIRA has what we call, or uses a part of the Kanban practice. And this is an example of a Kanban board. So what we can see here is that we're managing by status. So we've got items in our to-do list that could be thought of as our backlog. Once we're ready, and once our development team has availability, they can pick up the newest item from the backlog and put that in process. Once it is then ready for code review, it moves to the next phase. And then finally, once it's been reviewed and approved, it can be marked as done. This is a very simple example of a Kanban board, but this is honestly how a lot of organizations have it set up. These are very common phases within the life cycle of a project, of an Agile project. It can be made a little bit more complex, but it's really, the focus here is on simplicity, so that at any time, this may not be set up as sprints the way that a Scrum project is conducted, but it is thought that you can adapt very quickly and easily to new requirements that get picked up as they come in. This also gives everybody within the organization a very simple, quick view of where things stand in the project, and it also helps us to identify what we call the work in progress, or WIP, and see if there's any bottlenecks that we can help overcome. So those are the two examples that I mentioned that I'm most familiar with in working with Agile, but there are many others. And one of the bigger differences about Agile versus ITIL is, with ITIL we have these 5 large books. I actually have them on my own bookshelf, and I keep an electronic copy on my laptop. With Agile, the full library of Agile fits on these next 2 slides in my presentation. So it's really very open-ended. That's why there's so many different ways to implement it, because there's no real guidance on how you implement Agile. But some things that I've highlighted here, we talk about this in terms of software, but we can very, very easily see how just by substituting the word process for software, it helps to show us how we can implement better IT service management practices using Agile principles. There's a big focus here on customer satisfaction. We welcome changing requirements. Often I think it's within the ITIL framework, we're accused of wanting to stop all changes. We are providing results within weeks rather than months. We work closely with the business. So I think that's where ITIL was moving towards, but Agile really takes it a lot farther. There's a focus here as well on face-to-face conversation, as opposed to a strictly electronic conversation. And it really puts a lot of the responsibility down on the team. So not only does that make the work, it pushes the work down to the level where it should be, but it also helps to ensure better adoption of the processes if you get the teams involved. And this is the entire Agile Manifesto, which you can find online. Again, focused here on individuals' interactions. So focusing really on the business and the needs of the business. If I substitute, again, the word processes, you can see this really does fit well with the implementation of our ITIL processes. And I like this last one especially, responding to change. Agile methods are focused on quick responses to change and continuous development. So going back to ITIL and our friend W. Edwards Deming and the continual service improvement phase of the life cycle. So Deming had this, what we call either the Deming Cycle or the Plan, Do, Check, Act, PDCA cycle. And this speaks again to the iterative nature of the way that the Agile methodology works. So we first conduct planning, we then implement, we review and check our results, and then take corrective action as necessary. So if you think back to the Scrum slide, this is exactly what we're doing in each sprint. We're doing planning, we're doing development, we then review or check, and then finally do a retrospective. What could we do differently? How can we take corrective action? So just as that is in Agile, it's also the basis of the continual service improvement model in ITIL. So the model is, what is the vision? What's the strategy? Where are we now? Where do we want to be? How do we get there? Did we get there? And how do we keep that momentum going? I'm often asked when implementing ITIL, regardless of which methodology you use, so if you're using Agile methodology to implement ITIL practices and ITIL processes within your organization, in which order should you implement them? Often we start with incident management because it's one of the most basic responsibilities of IT is just to keep the lights on. If something's broken, fix it. But beyond that, really, I think we have to go back to the Agile Principles and Agile Manifesto. It's really about the needs of the organization, and it's not a one-size-fits-all type of approach. So we can certainly work with our customers to help to determine where are the biggest pain points. Again, change management usually ranks up there somewhere in the top 3 or 4 because it is so necessary for organizations, especially if you are facing governance or either from the outside or inside, whether you have to undergo audits or not, or if you're just wanting to be sure that for competitive reasons you don't have somebody make a change that might negatively impact your business. In working with change management, that's an especially important area where we want to help streamline things as much as possible. So keeping Agile practices in mind both when we're implementing change and also how we implement change itself, how we design those processes to be more in line with the Agile methodologies. So ultimately, what I'm hoping I've made clear through this presentation is that it's not Agile versus ITIL. It's not one or the other. They really do complement each other. There's, within both methodologies, they embrace the concept of the Deming Cycle. I would say that an Agile approach is ideal for the adoption of the ITIL ITSM framework. We have a lot of organizations with whom we work who do take that Agile approach, in that they don't try to implement all of ITIL at once. It's really, I'm not even sure if that's possible, and it's certainly not recommended. Agile can help simplify the processes themselves. So we've talked a lot during this presentation about how keeping Agile methodologies in mind can help us with the design of our change and release processes. But really, there are lessons for all of the phases and all of the processes within ITIL that we can take from the Agile methodologies.